Hey, welcome back to another edition of Kicks Over Coffee. I am your host, Matt Priest. I've got my coffee mug, and I'm joined by FDRA's chief economist, Gary Rains. Gary, I think we've done one of these before, if I'm not mistaken. But back then, times were good. There was reasons to be excited. Now the script is entirely flipped. And before we kind of get into the doldrums that is data coming in for footwear imports, I do want to call out my giant NC State mug my father-in-law gave me. And as a fellow graduate of North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina, we do have that in common, and we can commiserate together. And I'll be drinking a lot more coffee because I'm at home now and I have access to much cheaper coffee than being in the city and dropping $5 for a latte. So with that, this thing is entirely full. I'm not smaller. This mug is really big. And we're going to need this coffee to get through this data. So welcome to Kicks Over Coffee, Gary. It's good to have you on.
Hey, thanks, Matt. I appreciate the opportunity to come back and join Kicks Over Coffee. Indeed, this day and age, you really need the good caffeine jolt because the numbers are certainly depressing. You need that real upper to offset some of these trade numbers we're seeing coming in.
Yeah, so let's get right to it. The January import numbers caught my attention, and you do a lot of deep dives into different product categories and what's going on for imports. But the January numbers were jarring in particular because we had imports down 15.7%, was at the lowest January in volume in a decade, if I'm not mistaken. And so the trend lines, and this is before people even knew what the coronavirus was. And so now the trend lines we have to expect and anticipate will get even more dramatic moving forward. But walk us through those first numbers. When was the first kind of inkling that you knew something was up as it relates to the import data?
Frankly, of course, we look at these numbers carefully every month, broken out by a range of different product categories, not only total footwear, but, categories like athletic and bootwear and children's and men's and women's and leather and sandals and, a range of different types of footwear. And looking just at top line numbers, we had seen with the September data, which had come out in November, once we began to see that first tranche of increased tariffs under the Trump administration go into effect, we began to see it right away and, called it out to members that, hey, look, we're seeing this come to fruition, that we're seeing big declines in imports and substantial increases in duties, particularly, of course, duties from China. The issue being China still supplies about 2/3 of the volume of footwear the U.S. imports. So it is really—
That number 2/3, is it 67? Is it 66%? Where is that volume right now?
Yeah, it's right at, I think it finished 2019 just a hair above 66%. Yeah. So on average, in the typical American's closet, about 2 and 3 pairs of footwear are sourced from China.
Yeah. So keep going. Yeah. I mean, to me, it's just a staggering number. Even 67%. If I remember correctly, about a decade ago, we were hovering in the 90% range. So Absolutely. We have been moving away from China. But Sure. We're going to talk about 2 gut punches. This first gut punch was the China trade war, and the import data is starting to play out. Am I right?
Absolutely. So yes, the Chinese share has been steadily eroding for the last 10, 12 years or so, but still China still accounts for about 2/3 of the volume imported into the United States. So those increased duties on volume from China really has this compounded effect on the footwear industry in particular. And yeah, you're exactly right. Looking at these latest numbers, the January numbers that just came out the other day, we see that it was the lowest January footwear import volume in the last 10 years, and it was the biggest year-over-year decline. And you said 15.7%. That 15.7 is the biggest year-over-year decline in 43 months. At the same time that imports were the lowest January in 10 years, January was the biggest duties on footwear on record, the biggest January on record. Right. And I think it just kind of goes to attest to the issue going on here, that as volume continues to decline, not only from China, but worldwide, we're seeing duties, and especially duties per pair, continue to rise.
Which product categories were hit the hardest in those numbers? Is it bootwear? Is it kids? Is it athletic? Which saw the steepest decline?
Sure. For total footwear off 15.7, we saw that Children's was down in a volume basis about 23.5%, while sandals were down 24.5%. But really, the declines were broad-based. Every key category that we track saw a double-digit year-over-year decline in the volume of footwear imported in January.
So kid shoes have some of the highest duty rates on them imaginable. I mean, there's a pair of shoes that has a 67.5% duty rate. It was on list 4B, so it didn't get the additional 15 or 7.5% attached to it. But nevertheless, in a high duty environment, which we were in before the trade war and we now continue to be in, you're going to see these product categories get hit in a way that is hard to fathom when you start to think through the average duty rate. Even in the Trump era is just north of 2%. How do you organize all this in your mind where you have decline in imports and record duties?
Sure, it's really hard to wrap your head around how the volume and dollar basis can be declining, at a double-digit pace. Yet we're seeing duties increase at a double-digit year-over-year pace. In fact, to your point, looking at the January duties per pair from China, duties per pair worldwide, shipments from January 2020 to January 2019, the duties per pair on children's footwear imports rose 40.6%.
Oh my gosh. I mean, that's hard for any industry to take on. And then ultimately, we all know the Chinese don't pay these tariffs. The American consumer pays them because margins are so tight, particularly in footwear. Those costs increase get passed on to the consumer, and it's hard to kind of take that on in one fell swoop and to have that kind of increase. Would you say 43%?
40.6.
40.6, so 41% increase is just hard to even fathom. So that's the man-made crisis that was brought upon our industry. And you can argue the reasonableness of the administration to go after the Chinese in these areas, in areas we all have concerns about, and we can argue about tactics all day long. We're well beyond that at this point. Now we're entering into a phase where there's a natural crisis, right? A non-man-made crisis, in spite of what the fake news will tell you. There's no conspiracy. When you eat bats or hang out with weird animals, these things will jump to humans. And so as we head into trade data starting to flow in, or sales data, I should say, what can we expect in the near term for now, knowing it's too hard to predict in the medium or long term?
Sure. Again, the footwear industry has really seen this double whammy, if you will, both on the man-made side, looking at the tariffs imposed on footwear, particularly coming from China, then also the issues with the coronavirus that's impacting the demand side of the equation. So it's really this kind of 1-2 punch, if you will. Just this week, we saw January shoe store sales data that really didn't show much of any impact from the coronavirus at all. Of course, it really wasn't an issue in January in the United States. But more specifically, shorter term, of course, FDRA also does a proprietary, confidential sales study or a sales survey of participating members, and we saw a pretty substantial decline in weekly shoe store sales compared to the same week a year ago. And I think this really foreshadows what we're likely to see happen more broadly with data from the Census Bureau or from the Bureau of Economic Analysis that has yet to be released just yet. So I think this is kind of the canary in the coal mine. We're likely to see these substantial double-digit year-over-year declines in really, I think, aggregate retail sales, but certainly specific to shoe store sales. I think it's the canary in the coal mine.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, and that's why you said it twice. So the irony is that what's really interesting, we have our weekly calls with our members every Tuesday at 2 Eastern, and what we're hearing on the supply side is kind of a return to normalcy, and factories back up and running, almost full capacity, and suppliers starting to drive a lot of supply to the production facilities in Guangdong province and Fujian province and places like Wenzhou. And so I've kind of likened this. I was at NC State when Hurricane Fran came through in 1996. I was a sophomore, and go Wolfpack. And I remember at the time the hurricane came directly over Raleigh, and we got battered in the dorms for a number of hours. And then the eye passed over the campus, literally right over the campus. And we all went outside and you could see the stars and it was clear as day and it was beautiful. And then it wasn't a few moments later when the other side of the hurricane came in and swept through, and then we got pummeled again. And I mean, we were out of school for a multitude of weeks because of the destruction that hit the city. And I just have that vision in my mind as to what we face now. We had the production side storm push through as the virus was impacting China. We had this respite for a little bit, even if it was for a week, where we felt like production was getting back up and running. And we had a handful of cases in the U.S. And now we're entering into the other side, through the other side of the eye wall of the storm. And we're being battered right now on the demand side. And it's hard to reconcile that with what's going on in China as things seem to be picking back up. And so it'll be interesting to see how the import data is impacted. We know how the demand data is starting to get impacted, particularly as doors close. And so it's hard to wrap my mind around all of this, but it's not a pretty picture no matter how you look at it.
No, not at all. In fact, I've had some of the same conversations, kind of anecdotal reports of increased numbers of workers returning to shifts across China in a range of industries, certainly including footwear and apparel manufacturing along with it. But precisely to your point, while we're just now seeing the impact of the coronavirus show in the Chinese data, substantial declines in the January, February industrial production numbers were released just over the weekend. That has yet to really manifest itself in the U.S. data reported by Census Bureau or BEA, whomever. But I think we're likely to see that kind of wave begin to wash ashore in the U.S. data here soon, just as China is beginning to return to work now. If there's a silver lining to this awfully dark cloud, it may indicate that if we're beginning to see the workers return in China, if we have a similar situation in the U.S. with a bit of a lag, that we may begin to see a similar situation with workers, the coronavirus issue kind of reaching its peak and passing, and workers return in the U.S. perhaps in a month. Of course, it promises to be a pretty ugly month until we get to that point. But
right.
Much like what we had seen in China here, month and a half ago.
Yeah. Well, so as we close out, Gary, let me ask you this, because a lot of us look at data. There's so much data to access now as a company, as an individual, as a trade association, as an economist, as someone who looks at data all day long, every day. What are some key performance indicators you have your eye on? What would you encourage our members to keep an eye on as it relates to trade data for to kind of understand which way the wind is blowing one way or the other?
Sure. Indeed, we watch a stack of data points that come out all day, every day, it seems. Of course, key issues we're watching are, of course, both on the supply side and the demand side. We're watching the number of containers coming into West Coast ports to see how trends in that are, beginning to see that bottom out and perhaps rebound here soon. Of course, the number of empties going back out of West Coast ports is also indicative of increased business, increased manufacturing going on in China. In fact, even air cargo is something that is a bit of a leading indicator to kind of keep an eye on there, as expensive as that can be. But again, the weekly sales report that FDRA produces, again, is, I think, a great leading indicator of trends to watch going on across the broader retail market, certainly specific to shoe store sales, but also the broader retail market with a bit of a lag, since it's such a leading indicator there as well. So we have indicators on both the supply side and the demand side that certainly I would encourage FDR members to take a close look at. And any questions, by all means, reach out to us and let us know how we can help or what further issues we can dissect for you, that perhaps stones that we haven't peeked underneath yet, that might be some real nugget of insight that would really help the broader industry.
Yeah, hit us up at info@fdra.org if you have a desire for us to run numbers specific for your company or for a country in particular. Gary, this has been really helpful for me to understand. We'll keep doing these Kicks Over Coffee and pushing these out to the broader industry, because there's a lot of information out there. And I suspect there's a lot of folks working from home who want to have access to information on the fly. So thanks for joining me, and thanks as a fellow NC State grad for tolerating my giant NC State mug of this edition of Kicks Over Coffee. Folks, all you got to do to get access to more episodes of Kicks Over Coffee is go to kicksovercoffee.com. You'll see a number of interviews with key leaders in our industry talking about innovation and sustainability and retail. We'll continue to be producing these, particularly as we're all hunkered down in our homes. And we look forward to the next episode. In the meantime, if you have a desire to come on the show, just hit us up at info@fdra.org, and we'll add you to the list of potential candidates. So, Gary, thanks again for the insights as always, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode.